Chapter 1. The Owl of Silence. The following morning found us seated at a modest breakfast table in the vicarage of Redhill Chapel. The sun filtered through the diamond-paned windows, casting long rectangles of gold upon the floor, but its warmth did little to banish the heaviness that had settled over the village. The Reverend Pierce, though polite in manner, seemed haunted by some inner turmoil that flickered behind his eyes like a candle in the wind. Holmes, ever observant, made no mention of it, though I noted his occasional glances toward our host, as though waiting for a lapse in composure that would reveal more than words might offer. We had barely finished our tea when a knock came at the door. A thin, wiry man with a bristling mustache and a sharp nose entered, introduced to us as Constable Merrick. He gave Holmes a curt nod, though I could sense a wariness behind his manner. "I heard you'd arrived," he said. "Can't say I was expecting London detectives to descend on our quiet village, but I reckon you'll want to see what we've got." "Indeed," said Holmes, rising with alacrity. "I understand you were the first on the scene after Elias Wetherill vanished." "That's right. Got a message from the Reverend here that the Gravedigger hadn't come home that night. Found the grave half dug, tools lying about, but no sign of the man himself. No blood, no struggle, just gone. And the markings?" Merrick scratched at his chin. "Never seen the like. Circles, overlapping lines, some strange symbol in the middle, like a bird or a beast. We swept the area, but the rain that night washed away whatever footprints there might have been." "Has the grave been touched since?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. We posted a constable overnight, but nothing's been disturbed." Holmes turned to the Reverend. "And the parishioners, have any of them come forward with suspicions or claims of having seen something?" Reverend Pierce hesitated. "Not precisely, but I must admit people are uneasy. There have been whispers of shadows moving through the graveyard at night, doors creaking open when locked, even a report from Mrs. Aldwin, the widow who lives by the north gate, that she heard voices in the early hours, though no one was present." "Voices?" Holmes repeated, raising an eyebrow. "She described it as chanting," the Reverend said quietly. "We made our way back to the chapel grounds shortly thereafter, the constable leading us by a path that cut through a line of hawthorn trees, the morning mist still clinging to the undergrowth. The graveyard stretched out in hushed solemnity, frost clinging to the headstones and iron railings. We approached the half-dug grave, a neat rectangle of disturbed earth beside a tombstone too weathered to read clearly. Holmes crouched, inspecting the markings that remained. Though partially eroded by the elements, the faint outlines of a circle and a pair of curved lines were still visible near the head of the grave. He ran his gloved fingers along the soil, lifting a clump of it to his nose. "Something was burned here," he murmured. "Charcoal, but not from wood. Bone, perhaps or parchment." Constable Merrick grimaced. "You think it's some sort of black rite?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he pulled from his pocket a small glass vial and carefully collected a few pinches of the earth. He then stood, scanning the surrounding graves, his eyes alert. "I'd like to examine the chapel interior once more," he said. "And the records, burial logs, parish notes, anything kept from previous centuries." The Reverend nodded. "We keep most of them in the vestry. You're welcome to review them." Back within the chapel, the air was colder than outside, and the sense of quiet was nearly reverent. Holmes moved through the pews with a slow deliberation, pausing occasionally to glance at the worn stone carvings and brass fixtures. When we reached the pulpit again, he stopped, looking once more at the faded owl emblem in the archway. "Watson, what does that symbol remind you of?" I studied it. The owl with wide, unblinking eyes and wings curled inward around a pair of indistinct shapes. "Something ancient," I said. "Pagan, perhaps. It doesn't feel like the standard ecclesiastical ornamentation." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "This chapel may have stood for centuries, but the land beneath it is older still. Older, even than the Christian faith in these parts. We made our way into the vestry, a cramped and dusty room cluttered with ledgers and bound volumes. Holmes spent a good half hour flipping through brittle pages, occasionally tapping his finger upon an entry and making a low noise of interest. "Here," he said at last, beckoning us closer. "In 1763, there's mention of a burial delay due to omens in the earth." The vicar at the time wrote that certain signs had reappeared in the graveyard, including the Owl of Silence, a symbol feared by villagers and thought to be an ill portent. Reverend Pierce looked genuinely startled. "I have never seen that entry before." Holmes flipped ahead. "And again, in 1822, a parish worker vanished under circumstances similar to Elias's. No body ever found. They claimed he'd angered the old stone watchers, whatever that may mean." "The Owl of Silence," I said, the phrase sending a chill down my spine. Holmes closed the ledger with care. "It seems we are not the first to encounter this mystery." Outside, the bells in the village struck 11, their sound echoing distantly across the hills. Holmes rose and turned to the Reverend. "Have you a church warden I may speak with? Someone who's been in the village many years and may know more of its unofficial history?" "Old Mr. Corbett," the Reverend replied. "He's nearly blind now, but remembers more than most. Lives in the small cottage near the east wall of the chapel grounds." Holmes nodded. "Then let us pay Mr. Corbett a visit. I believe the past is trying very hard to speak to us. We need only find the right ears to listen." The mist was lifting as we crossed the churchyard once more, yet the silence had grown deeper somehow, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Holmes walked ahead with the steady stride of a man already turning pieces of the puzzle in his mind, while I followed with the uneasy sense that the dead beneath our feet were not entirely at rest. And so we went to seek a man whose memory might hold the key to a secret buried not just in the earth of Redhill, but in time itself. Chapter 2. Whispers among the gravestones. The following morning dawned gray and mist-laden, the London skyline barely visible beyond a curtain of sluggish fog. The embers of the previous evening's fire still smoldered faintly in the hearth at Baker Street as I stirred a tepid pot of coffee and glanced at my companion. Holmes sat cross-legged in the armchair opposite, a folded newspaper resting upon his knee, though his sharp eyes were not scanning the print. Instead, he appeared to be in that curious state of inward withdrawal that often accompanied the stirring of his deeper processes of deduction, eyes unfocused, fingers steepled, utterly still except for the rhythmic tapping of his forefinger. "Watson," he said abruptly, startling me as I reached for the sugar tin. "Do you recall the peculiar phrasing Mr. Banbury used last night in describing the scene at the chapel?" I thought for a moment. "He said the body was too fresh for the earth. A rather poetic description, I admit." "Exactly. And the implication there is not merely one of surprise at the condition of the deceased, but of suspicion, perhaps even fear." He tapped the arm of the chair twice. "There is something quite singular in that phrase. A man who digs graves for a living is unlikely to be spooked by the freshness of a corpse. You believe there is more to this than simple misidentification of a buried body?" "I believe," said Holmes, rising, "that there is something occurring in that remote churchyard which may not be supernatural, but is certainly unnatural. Pack your bag, Watson. We leave on the 11:40 train to Surrey. By midday we were trundling through the pastoral quiet of the English countryside, the smoke from our compartment mingling with the fine drizzle streaking across the window panes. Holmes, who had scarcely spoken more than a few clipped sentences since our departure, now sat upright with a map of southern parishes spread across his lap. I, for my part, amused myself with the morning edition of the Times, where the news of a small fire in Lambeth and the latest gossip from Parliament offered little to distract from the shadowy intrigue we were descending into. "Whitmore by Chessel," Holmes muttered, tracing a pale finger across the map. "A village scarcely worth a footnote in any gazetteer." And yet here we are, Watson, called by the twitch of an old gravedigger's nerves. Fascinating. Upon arriving at the station, a modest platform overgrown with moss and wildflowers, we found a solitary dog cart waiting. Its driver a wiry youth with a drooping cap and a somewhat distrustful squint. "You'll be Mr. Holmes, I reckon," he said without preamble. "Banbury told me to fetch you to the vicarage. He's there now with the Reverend." The ride was a short one, along a winding track bordered by leaning stone walls and damp hedgerows. Whitmore itself revealed little. A post office shuttered for midday, a crooked inn sign swinging noiselessly in the breeze, and the narrow spire of the chapel just visible over the slope of a small hill dot as we neared the vicarage. A charming Georgian house half smothered in ivy, I noticed. Holmes tilted his head slightly and sniffed the air. "There's a faint scent of peat smoke," he remarked. "Someone's been burning something nearby recently, too." Inside, we were greeted by Mr. Banbury, who had evidently regained a measure of composure since our previous meeting, though his fingers still worried at the brim of his hat as he led us into the study. The room was warm wood-paneled and lined with theological texts, though the man who occupied the chair by the hearth looked distinctly unclerical. "This is Reverend Edgar Blythe," Banbury introduced. "He's the new parson of St. Jude's. Came last spring from Sussex, didn't you, Reverend?" The man rose. He was in his mid-30s, clean-shaven, with an intelligent brow and a slight stoop in his shoulders, as though the weight of his calling sat heavily upon him. He extended a firm but cautious hand to Holmes, then to me. "I take it Mr. Banbury has shared with you the unfortunate discovery in the churchyard?" Blythe asked. "He has," Holmes replied, "and I understand the body is still available for inspection?" The Reverend nodded, though a slight grimace tugged at the corners of his mouth. "The authorities, such as they are in this quiet corner, have not yet acted. I felt it prudent to await the arrival of a more specialized eye." "Very wise," Holmes said shortly. "Have you had any disturbances in the parish since the burial?" "Only one," Blythe said slowly. "A curious one. 3 nights ago, a young boy, Tommy Ellison, the gardener's son, was found at the chapel gate just before dawn, in something of a delirium. He claimed to have seen a figure standing atop one of the gravestones, cloaked in feathers and with glowing eyes." "A spectral owl?" I ventured, recalling Banbury's earlier mention of local folklore. "Precisely," Blythe said grimly. "It has given rise to quite a bit of whispering among the villagers. Old superstitions, of course." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And where is this boy now?" "At home with his mother. The doctor says he'll recover fully, just a touch of fever and fright, but his story was unnerving." We agreed to inspect the body before dusk. The Reverend offered lanterns, and we set off across the sward to the chapel, a small stone structure with narrow arched windows and a crooked weather vane shaped like an angel with a trumpet. In the graveyard beyond, the fog hung in patches among the crooked rows of markers, and a murder of crows stirred noisily from a yew tree as we approached the opened grave. Holmes examined the coffin first, crouching to inspect the splintered wood and hinges. He brushed away some soil and retrieved a faint scrap of fabric from one corner gray with a fine weave, entirely unsuitable for burial. "Curious," he murmured, holding the cloth to the light. "This is not a shroud. And the stitching, Watson. You see here, hand-sewn but not English thread. Italian, perhaps." He turned his attention to the body. The man, who appeared to be in his early 40s, was dressed in a crumpled black suit, with no personal effects beyond a silver chain tucked into his waistcoat pocket. Holmes produced a small magnifying lens and inspected the chain, then the man's hands, which were uncalloused but bore faint traces of black ink beneath the fingernails. "A writer, perhaps," Holmes said softly. "Or a clerk, and certainly not a resident of Whitmore." Banbury, standing at the edge of the grave, cleared his throat nervously. "You'll find no one in the village missing, sir. We asked around." Holmes gave a tight nod. And yet this man lies in consecrated ground, unaccounted for. As we made our way back toward the vicarage, Holmes paused by the yew tree. He bent to inspect the base and retrieved a small, twisted piece of paper, half buried in the damp. Soil. He said nothing, but tucked it carefully into his coat. When we returned to the study, the fire had gone out. Holmes declined the Reverend's offer of tea and sat instead by the darkened grate, fingers steepled, eyes far away. "I fear," he said at last, "that Mr. Banbury's tale is only the beginning." Chapter 3. The Man in the Fog, the Early Morning. Mist clung to the streets of London like a damp shroud, curling through the railings and swirling low across the cobblestones. A gas lamp sputtered and hissed near the entrance to the Baker Street Underground, casting a flickering yellow glow. Across the waking city, inside our sitting room, the fire crackled, its warmth standing in stark contrast to the chill that crept in through the window panes. Holmes stood at the hearth, one arm resting on the mantel, the other hand holding a smoldering pipe that sent tendrils of smoke drifting toward the ceiling. He had been silent for some time, save for the occasional muttered phrase or sudden flick of his eyes as he stared into the embers. I, seated in my familiar chair by the bookshelf, finally broke the silence. "You've barely spoken since our return from Kensal Green yesterday, Holmes," I said. "Surely you've formed some theory from the gravedigger's odd behavior?" He turned toward me with a gleam in his eye. "The absence of a reaction, Watson, can be as telling as an outburst. That man Joseph Marin was afraid, but not in the way most are when questioned by a detective. His fear was quiet, measured. A man who knows more than he dares say." "And the missing burial log?" I prompted. Holmes nodded. "A curious omission. I sent a telegram early this morning to the local records office. If the burial registry was tampered with, they may hold a copy on file. We shall know soon." At that moment, a sharp knock rattled the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later with an envelope on a silver tray. A message just delivered. "Mr. Holmes," she said, eyes flickering with curiosity before she departed again. Holmes took the envelope and examined it with care. No crest, no return address. Hand-delivered, as I suspected. He slid it open and extracted a single sheet of paper. As his eyes skimmed the words, his expression darkened. "What is it?" I asked. He handed it to me, "Mr. Holmes, the dead rest uneasy when their secrets are exhumed. Let this one lie buried. You will find no peace digging into graves. Consider this your final warning." There was no signature, only a rough smear of ink at the bottom, as though the pen had been hastily dropped. "Well," I said, lowering the page, "that reads like a threat if ever I saw one." Holmes tapped his pipe against the hearth and reached for his coat. "A threat indeed, which means we're closing in on something worth hiding. Come, Watson. There is a man I intend to speak with before this morning's fog clears. Bring your revolver." 20 minutes later, we were descending into one of the older quarters of the city, Gray's End, a district riddled with alleys so narrow they barely permitted two men to pass abreast. The brick walls here bore the damp scent of centuries, and leaned together as if whispering secrets. Holmes moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized every map of the city. We stopped at a corner where a fruit stall leaned precariously outside a closed bakery. "There," Holmes pointed with his gloved hand. "See the doorway 2 shops down? That's where we'll find Amos Trellock, former gravedigger, discharged 2 months ago under odd circumstances." We approached the door, and Holmes knocked twice in a curious rhythm, 2 short raps followed by a pause. Then one final knock dotted opened a sliver. A gaunt man with sallow skin and a crooked nose peered out, suspicion burning in his eyes. "You got the wrong door," he rasped. Holmes held out a gloved hand. "Amos Trellock, we're here to speak about your time at Kensal Green. The name is Sherlock Holmes." The man's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked ready to bolt. But then something passed behind them, resignation perhaps. He stepped back. "Come in," he muttered. The interior smelled of smoke, ale, and damp wood. Trellick offered no invitation to sit, so Holmes and I remained standing. The man's fingers trembled slightly as he drew on a clay pipe, the smoke mingling with the stale air. "I've got nothing to tell the police," he said flatly. "I'm not the police," Holmes replied. "But I'm interested in what frightened you enough to abandon a position you'd held for nearly a decade." Trellick stared at Holmes. "Some things ought not to be disturbed." Holmes didn't flinch. "You mean the graves?" A bitter chuckle. "I mean what goes on after dusk. In those grounds. Men coming and going, not mourners, not family. Strange cargo arriving late in wagons. And sometimes the soil was disturbed without any order from the office. Smuggling?" I ventured. Trellick shook his head. "Not goods, people, or what used to be." Holmes stepped forward. "Are you suggesting that bodies were removed from graves?" Trellick hesitated, then gave the barest nod. "But why?" I asked. "To what end?" He swallowed hard. "All I know is, one night I saw Marin out there. He was with another man tall, with a limp. They were pulling something from a fresh grave, a burlap sack, long enough to hold a body. They put it on a cart and rolled it into the trees behind the chapel. I didn't stay to see where they went." "Did you recognize the man with the limp?" Holmes asked. "No, but he moved like a soldier one who'd taken a bad wound." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you recall that recent case you showed me in the newspaper, the one about the medical school fire?" "Yes," I said, startled. 2 weeks ago. A fire destroyed the anatomical theater at St. Swithin's College. Several specimens lost, including human cadavers," Holmes finished. Trellick's face went pale. "You think they're supplying?" "I think," Holmes interrupted gently, "that someone is trying to keep the dead from speaking." He stepped back toward the door. "Thank you, Mr. Trellick. You've helped more than you know. But I advise you not to speak of this to anyone else." The man nodded mutely, closing the door behind us as we stepped into the alley once more. I turned to Holmes as we walked. "This is darker than I expected." He nodded. "Yes, Watson. Grave robbing is old as burial itself, but this has a far more organized stench. And now, with a veiled threat in our post... someone is getting desperate." We walked on, the fog folding around us like a curtain, as we slipped deeper into the mystery that waited among the graves. Chapter 4. The Limping Man. Mist had thickened by the time we reached Baker Street once again, and a thin drizzle had begun to patter against the window panes. Holmes wasted no time upon our return. He shed his damp coat, threw it upon the stand, and crossed directly to his writing desk where the telegram from the municipal registry awaited. He tore it open, eyes scanning swiftly across the contents. He made a sound deep in his throat, halfway between amusement and irritation. "What is it?" I asked, unfastening my own coat. "The burial registry," Holmes replied, holding it up between two fingers. "Or rather, a duplicate of it. It seems the original has indeed gone missing from Kensal Green's office, but the Board of Burials keeps a master copy." He laid it on the desk and smoothed it open. "Let us see now." I stepped beside him and peered over his shoulder as he traced his finger down a list of entries dated in the past month. It was a grim roll call of the recently departed, and yet nothing at first glance struck me as unusual, until Holmes tapped once against a name halfway down the list. "Here," he said, "Eliza Mary Howarth, buried 3 days prior to our visit, supposedly in plot 39A. What of it?" Joseph Marin never mentioned this burial. Neither did he show us that quadrant of the cemetery. "Why conceal one grave from our view?" I nodded slowly. "Especially if this Eliza Howarth was the one whose grave was tampered with." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Now recall what?" Trellick said the man with Marin had a limp. A soldier's limp. And you think that ties back to the medical cadavers stolen from St. Swithin's College? Not merely stolen, Watson, Holmes said. I believe they were replaced. I stared at him. Replaced? With what? With fresh bodies, he said quietly. Young, whole, unscarred bodies. The kind no one would question until too late. It took a moment for his implication to settle in. I felt a chill run up my spine. You think someone is murdering innocents and burying them under false names to disguise the theft of corpses? I think someone is supplying bodies to unscrupulous institutions under the guise of medical necessity, and someone else is helping cover the trail. There was a long pause. Holmes stood, moving to the fireplace, where he relit his pipe with a sliver of match. We must return to Kensal Green, Watson, but not in daylight. Tonight, we pay a visit after hours. It was shortly after midnight when we approached the cemetery gates once more. The streets were empty save for the occasional clatter of a carriage wheel in the distance. A veil of fog hung low and heavy over the iron railings. Holmes produced a key from his pocket, likely obtained through one of his many obscure contacts, and we slipped inside. Kensal Green was transformed at night. The headstones loomed like sentinels in the dark, and the trees whispered in the stillness. We moved silently through the rows, lantern in hand, until Holmes stopped near a cluster of newer graves. Here, he whispered. Plot 39A. The marker was plain, recently carved. Eliza Mary Howarth. Born 1865. Died 1894. Beloved sister. Holmes. Crouched low, brushing away some loose soil at the base of the headstone. The earth had been disturbed more recently than the official burial date would suggest. He glanced at me. Help me, Watson. We need only dig down a short way to confirm it. Together we worked quickly, carefully peeling back the wet soil. After some effort, Holmes' spade struck something hollow, a wood panel, likely the top of the coffin. He knelt and carefully pried the lid open. I expected to see a body. Instead, there was nothing but heavy bricks wrapped in muslin. Holmes let out a quiet exhalation, as I feared. Good heavens, I muttered. So the coffin was never used? Oh, it was used. Just not for Eliza Howarth. These bricks kept the weight right, to fool anyone who inspected it casually. We covered the grave once more, replacing the sod and cleaning our tools. Holmes stood, brushing dirt from his coat. This was a staged burial. The question remains, where's the real Miss Howarth? A sound stopped us cold. From somewhere beyond the trees came the crunch of gravel, slow, steady, deliberate. Holmes immediately extinguished the lantern. We crouched low behind the headstones, eyes straining in the dark. The footfalls drew closer. Then we saw him tall, wrapped in a dark cloak, his stride uneven. The limping man, Holmes whispered. He passed not 10 yards from us, wheeling a cart. Something was slumped across it, wrapped in OILCL. OTH. Holmes touched my shoulder. We follow. The man wheeled the cart down a narrow trail behind the cemetery's west chapel, weaving between ancient tombs and low walls until we reached a small outbuilding, perhaps once a groundskeeper's shed. He paused, checked behind him once, then pulled out a key and vanished inside. Holmes waited a beat before rising silently. We'll go around the rear. We crept toward the back of the structure, where a boarded-up window offered a view through a knothole in the wood. Holmes motioned for me to look. Inside, the man was unwrapping the figure on the cart. My stomach turned. It was a young woman, pale, lifeless, but untouched. She could have been asleep if not for the stiff, unnatural angle of her neck. She's freshly dead, I murmured. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Not dead long, and not embalmed. He's preserving her for medical use. Just then, we heard another voice from within, low, graveled. I told you to stop taking from this district. It's too hot. I had no choice, the limping man replied. There's demand. I got orders. Holmes leaned back from the crack. There's someone else involved, likely a financier. This man is a procurer. He delivers the bodies. And if there's an order, I said grimly, then there will be more. Holmes was already moving. Come, Watson, we've seen enough. Time to inform Inspector Lestrade. Grave robbing is a crime, but what we are uncovering may be far worse. We slipped away into the night, the fog swallowing our footsteps as the conspiracy behind London's newest graves began to stir from its shadows. Chapter 5. A Whisper in Threadneedle Street. The early hours of the morning found Holmes and me seated once more in the dim comfort of our sitting room at Baker Street. The fire burned low. A pot of coffee steamed gently on the table between us, and Holmes, jacket off, sat in his armchair with the grave air of a man assembling a puzzle whose edges now revealed the shape of something truly sinister. Neither of U.S. had spoken much since our return from Kensal Green. The sight of the young woman's body hidden so coldly in that outbuilding had cast a pall of silence over the rest of the night. Now Holmes stirred at last, setting down his cup and reaching for his notebook. We are, I fear, looking at something far more organized than mere resurrection men, Watson, he said quietly. You believe there is a syndicate at work? I believe we are only brushing the hem of a much darker garment, Holmes replied. One that stretches from the cemeteries of Kensal Green to the surgical halls of London's elite medical colleges. The limping man is but a foot soldier in a wider operation. I rubbed my eyes, weary but alert. You mentioned before replacing cadavers. Could that mean this ring is supplying bodies for dissection, even demonstration? Exactly. It is one thing to rob graves for profit, a horror in itself. But it is quite another to stage false burials, steal the living, and deliver them freshly dead to medical institutions who do not ask questions. Holmes drew out a telegram slip from his desk drawer and held it up. I sent word to Lestrade before we returned home. I expect him by noon. Sure enough, the familiar knock came shortly after 10. Inspector Lestrade entered, looking somewhat skeptical beneath his bowler hat, though not entirely dismissive. Well, Holmes, he said, your message was urgent enough. You said bodies were being stolen and swapped? Holmes stood, folded his arms. I said worse than that. Inspector, how many missing persons have been reported this month? Specifically women under the age of 30. Lestrade blinked. You'll have to be more specific. London's a wide net. You want me to check records? Start with Threadneedle Street, the Bank District, and with an Eliza Mary Haworth, recently listed as deceased and buried, yet whose grave contains nothing but bricks. Bricks? Lestrade's brows lifted. What are you suggesting? Holmes led him to the fireplace. I am suggesting, Inspector, that we have stumbled upon an elaborate fraud, one where legitimate identities are appropriated for burials that never occur, masking the disappearance of real victims whose bodies are redirected for private medical use. The woman we saw last night was not embalmed. She was fresh. That alone suggests murder. Lestrade drew in a sharp breath. And the man? Trellick's limping stranger is our link. He delivers the bodies. But I believe the orders come from elsewhere, likely an institution, maybe even a university. Somewhere that requires corpses with no paper trail. And they're getting them. The inspector pinched the bridge of his nose. That's serious. Holmes, if what you're saying is true, I'll need something more than speculation. Holmes nodded. And you shall have it. Tonight, I propose we catch the limping man red-handed. But first, I need to learn more about Eliza Mary Haworth. He turned to me. Watson, would you be so good as to accompany me to Threadneedle Street? By noon, we were walking among the sober facades of London's financial quarter. It was a cold, gray afternoon. The clouds hung low over the banks and counting houses, and clerks moved in and out of offices with harried pace and bundled coats. Our destination was a small ledger firm called Haworth and Tyndall, nestled discreetly between a tailor and a tea importer. A clerk informed us that Eliza Haworth had not been an employee. but the niece of the firm's founder, Mr. Alfred Howarth. We were shown in to meet the man himself, a thin, fastidious gentleman in his early 60s with pinched lips and a gaze sharp as a hawk's. He rose as we entered. "I was told you are making inquiries about my niece," he said, wary. "Has something happened?" "I am Sherlock Holmes," Holmes said with quiet gravity. "This is my associate, Dr. Watson. I'm afraid the matter is sensitive. It concerns your niece's recent death." Mr. Howarth's face fell. "Ah, yes, a tragedy. She passed just a week ago. Pneumonia, the doctors said. I paid for the funeral myself." "Did you see her body before the burial?" Holmes asked. Bluntly, Howarth's brow furrowed. "No, I was told it would be unwise, infection and such. But I received the death certificate. The papers were in order." "Who arranged the burial?" "A gentleman from Kensal Green called Joseph Marin handled the details. Eliza had no other family. It was all so sudden." Holmes leaned forward. "Forgive my insistence, but are you absolutely certain that your niece is dead?" Mr. Howarth opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Something flickered behind his eyes, confusion, perhaps even fear. "What are you implying, Mr. Holmes?" "That someone may have used your niece's identity to fake a burial. The real Eliza Howarth, if she has indeed died, may not have reached her grave at all." There was a long silence. Then Howarth spoke again, voice quieter. "She was staying in Whitechapel, last I heard, with a friend, Miss Clara Dean. I hadn't seen her in nearly 3 weeks before I received the letter about her death." Holmes nodded. "Do you have that letter still?" Howarth reached into a desk drawer and produced it. Holmes took it, read it silently, and handed it to me. The letter was typed coldly formal and bore no sender's name. It merely stated that Eliza had died of pneumonia and that her burial would be handled appropriately. The date was 4 days before her alleged funeral. Holmes studied the envelope. "Posted from Aldgate Station. Thank you," he said to Howarth. "We may be in touch again soon." Back in the cab, Holmes was quiet, deep in thought. "She may never have died of natural causes," he said finally. "This letter was manufactured. The same way the coffin was faked, the papers arranged. Marin is no mere undertaker, he's a broker of bodies. But someone is providing him names, addresses, victims." I turned to him. "And Clara Dean? She may be the key, or the next victim. Tonight, we go to Whitechapel, and if the limping man returns to Kensal Green..." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "We shall be waiting." Chapter 6. Into the lion's den. The evening deepened over London. A leaden sky bruised with twilight, pressing down upon rooftops soaked in grime. The fog, that ever-present London companion, rolled in thick coils down the alleys and main streets alike, swallowing the yellow gaslight until it glowed like distant embers. Our hansom cab rattled over the uneven cobbles of Whitechapel. The driver hunched and silent, the horse's breath a cloud in the cold air. Beside me, Holmes sat forward, elbows on knees, fingers pressed tightly together beneath his sharp chin. His eyes, usually darting with restless intellect, were narrowed in concentrated silence. I could see he was forming a latticework of possibilities. Each detail, from the Howarth funeral, the phony death certificate, and the strange figure in the churchyard, now sliding into place in his mind. Like a chessboard in motion, the address we pursued led us to a narrow terrace near Hanbury Street. The houses were close and tall, the sort of soot-cloaked dwellings that seemed to perpetually mourn. Laundry hung stiff from windows, and cats prowled along the ledges with the caution of creatures long adapted to human indifference. A brass plate on the door read, "Mrs. Winifred Smollett, rooms to let." Holmes stepped down first and rapped twice. A moment later, the door creaked open to reveal a squat woman with a knitted shawl about her shoulders and eyes as heavy-lidded as a lizard's. "Yes?" she said with no enthusiasm. "Miss Clara Dean?" Holmes inquired, already slipping off his gloves. His tone was firm, but not unkind. The landlady gave him a narrowed look. Second floor. Not back yet, though. Usually in by 7. Holmes. Passed her a half-crown with a whisper of leather. Would you object if we waited in her room? We are friends of Miss Dean's family. There's a matter of urgency. The woman glanced at the coin and with a shrug that suggested neither approval nor curiosity, waved us through. The interior stairway groaned beneath our steps as we ascended, the narrow corridor dimly lit by a single sconce flickering against peeling wallpaper. At the top, she pointed us toward a narrow door, then turned away without another word. Clara Dean's lodgings were modest but clean. A narrow bed stood against the far wall, the counterpane neatly folded. A washstand with a chipped pitcher and a small writing desk beneath a fog-misted window completed the furnishings. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, and on the desk, beside a battered book of poetry, sat a framed photograph of 2 young women smiling side by side, one of whom I recognized from the Haworth family album. Eliza and Clara. Holmes murmured, his gaze softening a fraction. The photograph of innocence. He approached the writing desk, his hands moving with surgical delicacy. A woman's room is rarely without secrets, Watson. The drawer there. He opened it with barely a sound. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a thin blue ribbon, a small sewing kit, and a folded piece of cream paper sealed with red wax. Holmes removed it carefully and sniffed it. A hint of formaldehyde, he said softly. A strange perfume for correspondence. He broke the seal and read quickly, then passed the note to me. The letterhead was unfamiliar but official in tone. Lambeth Anatomical Institute, private and confidential. Dear Miss Dean, in light of your recent inquiry, we are pleased to inform you that we may have opportunities in our laboratory for discreet assistance. While our work requires utmost discretion and fortitude, it is compensated accordingly. If still interested, present yourself at the side entrance on Clybourne Street at precisely 11 o'clock on Thursday evening. Respectfully, Doctor. I see Ketteridge. Holmes paced the small room, the letter still in his hand. Ketteridge, he said under his breath. Now that is a name I have not encountered in some time. He was expelled from St. Bartholomew's for anatomical practices considered distasteful even by Victorian standards. And yet here he is, resurfaced like a corpse from the Thames, running what purports to be an educational facility. I looked at the note again. You think this is bait? I do not merely think it, Watson, I am certain of it. Clara Dean, in her desire to do good, or perhaps uncover her friend's fate, is being drawn into the jaws of a very dark machine. This isn't just about stolen corpses anymore. This is commerce. Industrialized death. Holmes turned suddenly, his voice lowered. You recall the churchyard porter said something odd, that this was not the first brick burial. If multiple graves have been falsified, then this is a network, not a solitary crime. And Ketteridge is its architect. At that moment, the floorboards on the landing creaked. Holmes signaled me to silence and stepped back into the shadows near the WASHTAND. The doorknob turned. A young woman entered, her expression first cautious, then startled. She wore a threadbare coat, her auburn hair damp from fog, cheeks ruddy with cold. At once, she reached into her handbag defensively. Miss Clara Dean? Holmes asked, stepping into the lamplight. Her eyes flared. Who are you? Why are you in my room? I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are not here to harm you. In fact, we may well be the only ones trying to keep you safe. She didn't lower her bag. You broke into my room. We were let in by your landlady, and only because your name has arisen in connection with something very serious, the death of your friend, Eliza Haworth. Her expression crumpled at the name. She dropped onto the bed as though struck. Eliza is dead, she whispered. They wrote to me, pneumonia, buried already. I didn't even get to. She trailed off, her voice choking. Holmes knelt beside her. And yet her coffin was filled with bricks. Eliza was never buried. She was taken, we believe murdered. Clara stared, horror dawning in her eyes. No, that can't be. Why would they? Holmes opened the letter. This came from Lambeth Institute, did it not? You've been offered employment. But what if that offer was never meant to lift you up, but to shut you up? What if you were asking too many questions? She nodded slowly. I did ask. I wrote to the hospital. I wrote to the undertaker. Nobody answered. And then this offer arrived. It felt like fate. Holmes spoke gently but firmly. You are in danger, Miss Dean, but you can help stop this. You can do what Eliza never could. A long silence followed. Then Clara Dean straightened her back, brushing a lock of damp hair behind her ear. I'll go, she said. I'll keep the appointment, but only if you'll be close by. Holmes stood, nodding gravely. I will not let you out of my sight. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across Holmes's concentrated face. He lit his pipe and moved to the window, gazing out into the black. You think Ketteridge is behind it all? I asked. I think he is the gatekeeper. But I suspect there is someone above him, someone orchestrating this with a surgeon's precision. He turned, and the limping man? Our friend from the cemetery. He is no mere grave robber. No, he walks like a man who was once powerful, injured perhaps, and exiled from polite society. You think he'll be there tomorrow? I think he'll be watching, and we must be ready. Because tomorrow, Watson, we step into the lion's den. Chapter 7. The Anatomy of Shadows Thursday evening arrived with an eerie hush upon the city. London, cloaked in damp fog and muffled by layers of gray cloud, seemed to hold its breath as darkness descended upon its soot-streaked streets. Holmes stood before the fire in our Baker Street sitting room, adjusting the buttons of his dark overcoat. His face was calm, yet there was a peculiar intensity behind his eyes, as if he had glimpsed the edge of something monstrous and was preparing to meet it face to face. I trust, Watson, that your revolver is loaded and easily drawn? He asked without turning. I tapped the breast pocket of my coat. Always when following you into the unknown. Excellent. I suspect we will need to remain ghosts this evening. Miss Dean's courage is admirable, but if this is the trap, I believe it to be. We must not allow her to fall through its teeth before we spring it shut. I watched as he carefully packed a slender pair of binoculars, a small folding knife, and a silver whistle into his coat pockets. And if the trap is more elaborate than you anticipate, then we improvise, my dear Watson, as always. By 10:30, we were settled inside a hansom cab several streets away from Clybourne Street, a forgotten lane nestled between two crumbling warehouse districts south of the Thames. The fog here clung low and fetid, rising in sulfuric clouds. From the sewers beneath, gas lamps flickered weakly, casting more shadow than light, while the occasional clatter of cartwheels echoed with unnatural hollowness. Clara Dean stepped out of a second cab, her form barely discernible in the mist. She wore a plain gray dress, a scarf around her neck, and the air of a woman steeled for something unspeakable. She did not look back. Holmes and I followed at a discreet distance, keeping to the shadows and allowing the mist to serve as our veil. Clara turned left at a boarded-up grocer's shop and approached. A rusted iron gate nestled between two leaning brick buildings. Above the gate, a worn sign read, Lambeth Anatomical Institute Private Entrance, Staff Only. Holmes tapped my arm. As Clara pushed the gate open and disappeared down a narrow stairwell lit only by a single overhead bulb, quickly, he whispered, "Dot." We slipped behind a stack of crates at the alley's edge, peering between slats to watch as a tall, cadaverous man in a stained white coat opened the heavy door at the base of the stairs. His bald head gleamed in the gaslight, and one of his eyes bore a milky cast. Dr. Ignatius Ketteridge. He did not greet Clara, but simply stepped aside to let her pass. The door closed behind her with a metallic clang that echoed up the alley like the lid of a coffin. Holmes waited precisely 30 seconds before he moved. We darted across the alley, slid through the gate, and descended the steps. Holmes pressed his ear to the door. "She is being led somewhere further inside," he murmured. "The air's vibration is low, a corridor or possibly a basement level. No raised voices." He pulled a small tool from his pocket and worked the lock in silence. Within seconds, it clicked open. The door creaked slightly as we entered inside. The corridor was dimly lit and smelled strongly of antiseptic and formalin, a scent I had come to associate with morgues and dissection rooms. The walls were painted a pale green that had yellowed with time. A series of frosted glass lamps buzzed faintly overhead, illuminating a worn wooden floor. We crept along the hallway, careful to avoid the few squeaking floorboards. Distant footsteps echoed from the far end. Clara's perhaps, or her guide's. Holmes paused before a door marked laboratory storage. He opened it just wide enough to peer inside. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of preserved organs, anatomical charts, dissecting equipment, and crates marked specimen, fragile. In the corner stood a covered gurney with something large and motionless beneath a canvas sheet. Holmes nodded toward it, and I moved to the gurney with a tightening in my stomach. I drew back the sheet. What lay beneath was not human, at least. Not entirely. It was a mannequin of some kind. Or so I thought at first. But closer inspection revealed it to be something else entirely. A simulacrum constructed from actual human parts, stitched skin, bones lacquered and wired, real hair threaded into a waxen scalp. A surgical teaching tool, perhaps. Or something far darker. I covered it again quickly and looked to Holmes. "There's a line between instruction and desecration," I said. Holmes merely nodded. "And this man has crossed it with a surgeon's precision." A faint click drew our attention back to the hallway. Further down, a door was being opened, and the muffled sound of voices reached us. Holmes motioned for silence, then edged toward the sound. We pressed ourselves against the wall beside a tall wooden door, slightly ajar, with the words "Operating Theater" burned into a brass plaque. Inside, Clara stood nervously before a long table. Overhead, harsh white light cast her shadow against the tiled floor like a wraith. Ketteridge loomed before her, his expression unreadable. "I must be sure of your fortitude," he was saying. "There are things we do here that require an unconventional stomach." Clara held her voice steady. "You wrote that you needed an assistant. We do, but only one who will not ask too many questions." A new voice entered then, deep and rough like gravel beneath boots. "She do. She's got the look of someone who can keep her mouth shut, or who knows what happens when she doesn't." Holmes's eyes sharpened. He turned toward the voice and pressed one eye to the crack in the door. "It's him," he whispered. "The man from the graveyard. The one with the limp." I looked through the narrow gap as well. The man was tall, with a heavy overcoat, one shoulder hunched. His right leg dragged slightly as he moved, the foot turned outward. His face was gaunt but hard, with a long scar cutting from cheekbone to jaw. He looked like a man who had once been powerful, perhaps military now, reduced to working in shadows. "What is this place really?" Clara asked quietly. Neither man answered at first. Then Ketteridge spoke again, this time without the thin civility of earlier. "This, Miss Dean, is where society's cast-offs find purpose, where the dead pay for the living, and where questions are best left unasked." At that moment, Holmes stepped back. "We've seen enough. We must get her out now." "How?" "By drawing their attention elsewhere." Before I could stop him, Holmes took a metal instrument from the lab shelf and hurled it through the corridor window. The shattering glass exploded with such violence that both men inside the theater turned immediately. Clara startled, but did not scream. "What the devil?" The limping man growled, Stay here, Ketteridge barked, already moving toward the door. Holmes grabbed my arm. Now. We stepped into the corridor just as Ketteridge and the limping man rushed past in the opposite direction. Clara's eyes widened in recognition, and she ran to us at once. "We must go quickly," Holmes said. Through the service corridor, I saw a hatch near the rear entrance. The three of us hurried down the passageway, dodging the flickering bulbs and cabinets of medical horrors. We reached a heavy service door, which Holmes shoved open with a grunt. Beyond it, a narrow stairwell led up to a side yard choked with overgrown weeds. The cold night air hit us like a slap. We didn't speak until we were half a block away, our breath heaving in the alley behind a coal yard. Clara leaned against the wall, panting, "Thank you." Holmes's eyes were hard, still fixed in the direction of the Institute. "They've tasted fear now. They'll retreat, hide, burn what needs burning, but it's too late. We have names, faces, and locations." "And the man with the limp?" I asked. Holmes's jaw tightened. "I know who he is now. Or rather, I know who he was. A man presumed dead in India. A surgeon disgraced and stripped of rank. And if I'm correct, he looked to me. He may be the true hand behind the vanishing violinist." Chapter 8. Shadows among the stones. The steady drizzle veiled the windows of Baker Street as Holmes sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on a single playing card, a worn jack of spades that lay on the table before him. I had grown familiar with this particular posture, elbows resting on the armrests, fingertips pressed together, and a hawk-like intensity behind his narrowed eyes. It was a silence I dared not break, for I knew it to be his most fertile state of thought. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the Persian rug. Outside, the city seemed suspended in gray, the kind of chill that pressed against the bones and carried whispers along empty alleyways. Even the carriages clattering down Baker Street did so as if in subdued tones, muffled by the rain. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the hush with the crisp precision of a guillotine. "Tell me again what you noticed about the gravedigger's boots." I blinked. "Holmes, I merely said they were caked with reddish earth, thicker than the cemetery soil. I didn't think, but you did notice. And that, my friend, is the seed." He rose abruptly, sending the card fluttering to the floor. "Come, we must speak again to Mr. Hamley." We left immediately, Holmes moving with purpose, as though the rain merely sharpened his senses. By the time we arrived once more at Highgate Cemetery, the gray light of day had begun to pale into a silver dusk, the mist curling low along the crooked iron fences. Mr. Hamley, the stoop-backed gravedigger, emerged from the groundskeeper's hut with a scowl. His battered cap hung low over his brow, and the ever-present shovel rested near his boots. He regarded Holmes with a wary squint, perhaps recalling the detective's previous inquiries, which had left the man more unsettled than cooperative. "I trust you've come to unearth no more of my character, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice a rasp. "Only facts, Mr. Hanley," Holmes replied smoothly. "And I believe you've unwittingly buried one in plain sight." Holmes gestured subtly toward the spade leaning against the hut. "Do you recall the day you dug the new plot behind the Pharaoh mausoleum?" Hamley scratched at his bristled jaw. "Tuesday. Just before dusk. Why?" Holmes took a slow step forward, eyes never leaving the gravedigger's face. "Because the reddish earth on your boots does not match the clay of the Pharaoh plot. That soil is gray-dense and granular, but the residue on your solace comes from a looser, iron-rich sediment. You were somewhere else." Hamley's jaw worked. "I don't wander where I've no business." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then why do your boot prints appear behind the chapel, past the locked gate, precisely where the second body was found? The heel of your right boot has a chip shaped like a crescent. I saw it myself, near the old crypt." The old man hesitated, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I was looking for a vagrant," he said at last. One's been skulking round lately. Thought he might have climbed in through the broken fence. Holmes nodded as if this satisfied him, though I knew better. And did you find him? No. Just heard a sound, something rustling near the crypts. Went to look, saw naught. There was a pause as Holmes studied him. The silence stretched taut, like the moment before a violin string breaks. Then Holmes gave a curt nod. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Hamley. We left the hut and struck out across the sodden grass, heading toward the eastern quarter. As we passed a row of ivy-clad stones, Holmes spoke quietly, his breath fogging in the air. He's lying. He saw something or someone, but fear has silenced him. Which raises the question, what could terrify a man who spends his life among the dead? The Pharaoh mausoleum loomed ahead, its stone facade cracked with age. Moss clung to its edges like a velvet shroud. The heavy iron door was chained and locked, just as it had been on our last visit. Yet Holmes knelt and examined the base, brushing rain from the threshold with a gloved hand. Here, he murmured. See this faint groove? I leaned down. Scrape marks? Precisely. The door's been opened recently. Perhaps in the dark, perhaps during the last storm, but open nonetheless. The stone has shifted. But wouldn't we have heard? Or seen them? Holmes rose, brushing his hands. Not if it was done under the cloak of storm or shadow, and not if the visitor had a key. He turned away briskly. We're not done here, Watson, but to push further would spook our prey. We must let them. Believe we are content with what we know. That night, the fog settled thickly over London, and we returned to Baker Street, drenched and contemplative. The flicker of gas lamps did little to warm the gloom as Holmes spread out a map of the cemetery. Across the sitting room table, several locations had been marked in red ink. The Pharaoh mausoleum, the chapel crypt, the caretaker's quarters, and a small circled spot near the edge of the grounds. I pointed to the latter. What's here? Holmes tapped the circle. A disused well, sealed over a decade ago. A child once fell in survived, but the incident forced the vicar to have it bricked up. Still, the shaft remains beneath. I felt a shiver despite the heat of the fire. You think something's been hidden there? I believe, Holmes said slowly, that every graveyard has its share of ghosts, but not all of them are dead. A knock on the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a folded note. This just arrived, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Only your name in red ink. Holmes took the note and sliced it open with his penknife. His eyes moved across the page, then narrowed. What is it? I asked. He passed it to me. Written in angular scrawl. Leave the dead in peace. Mr. Holmes, not all secrets are yours to exhume. I looked up, unsettled. A threat? A warning, Holmes corrected. Which confirms we're making progress. They are growing nervous. Morning brought no peace. Before breakfast had cooled, there was a heavy knock. Inspector Lestrade entered, boots muddy and face drawn. We've got another Holmes, he said. Old man found by the eastern wall, throat cut. Same crescent mark on his wrist. Holmes's mouth set into a hard line. Where exactly? Near the old gardener's quarters, just behind the chapel wall. Holmes turned without another word, grabbing his coat. What is it? I asked as we followed Lestrade to the waiting cab. I fear, Holmes murmured, that the gravedigger's secret is no longer one of mere curiosity. We are chasing something or someone who buries more than bodies. Chapter 9. The man beneath the bell tower the wind whipped through. The yews as we stepped once more into the grounds of Highgate Cemetery, the early morning fog rising from the damp earth like the very breath of the dead. Holmes's boots made no sound upon the gravel, but I was less practiced, and my steps echoed faintly as we approached the small path running behind the eastern wall. Inspector Lestrade had already cordoned off the area, his constables flanking. A small cord of rope encircling the newest horror. The body lay just beyond the ruined, Gardener's quarters, a crumbling stone shed consumed by ivy and age. The corpse was that of a man in his 60s, clad in a long black coat, now soaked with rain and blood. His head lolled to one side at an unnatural angle. Even in death, his face retained a rictus of surprise, his eyes wide as if whatever he had seen before the fatal moment had both terrified and bewildered him. Holmes crouched beside the corpse, his fingers moving like a concert pianist's, light, precise, unshaking. Throat cut with a short blade, he murmured, but no arterial spray nearby. He was killed elsewhere and deposited here. He pointed to the man's shoes. Note the clean soles. The mud hasn't touched them. He was carried, Lestrade grimaced. We've no idea who he is. No papers on him. Just that strange mark. He lifted the wrist gently, revealing the same crescent-shaped scar we had seen before. It was no longer a curiosity, it was a calling card. Holmes rose, brushing off his coat. This isn't the work of a common killer. Someone is orchestrating this, Lestrade. Each move calculated, each corpse a message. Lestrade folded his arms. But what's the message? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the ruined gardener's shed and examined the moss-covered lintel. Watson, what do you make of this? I followed his gaze. A rusted hook, perhaps once for a lantern. Exactly, Holmes replied. And below it, scratched into the stone, he traced a line I had not seen before. A faint carving, curved like a crescent moon, mirrored in miniature. Lestrade leaned in. So whoever killed this man knows the place well enough to leave a sign. Holmes straightened, or wishes us to believe as much. We returned to Baker Street before noon. Holmes sank into his armchair with a weariness I had seldom seen. The rain had begun again, streaking the windows in long rivulets. I poured tea and sat opposite him. What troubles you most? I asked. Holmes exhaled sharply. The symbolism, Watson. A crescent scar, carved into flesh and stone, a warning note. And now, 2 murders with no apparent motive, both within sacred ground. He reached into the drawer of the desk and retrieved the Jack of Spades, the same card he had contemplated the night before. He held it up to the light. Have you ever considered why this card was left at the first scene? A gambler's token, perhaps. I offered, or an executioner's emblem, Holmes replied darkly. The Jack is often the betrayer, the rogue in the court of kings, a warning of treachery. Whoever left it did so not randomly, but with the full knowledge of its weight. He rose and paced. We are not merely hunting a murderer, Watson. We are chasing a mind as methodical as my own, yet far more willing to descend into darkness. Just then, there was a knock. Mrs. Hudson entered with an envelope on a silver tray. This came by special messenger, sir. No return address, just a peculiar stamp. Holmes took it with a frown. The seal bore an embossed image, a weeping angel beneath a crescent moon. He opened it carefully and removed the parchment within. It read, "The soil remembers. But do you? The first sin is buried. The second cries out. Will you silence the third?" I read the note over his shoulder and felt my blood chill. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, only scanned the message twice more. Then, at last, he turned to me. "We must return to the chapel crypt tonight," I started. "Holmes, the chapel is locked. We've no key, and it is forbidden to enter without authorization." A glint appeared in his eyes. "Then it is fortunate that the dead rarely object to being disturbed." That evening, under the veil of twilight, we stood once again at the wrought iron gate leading to the chapel's rear crypt. Holmes had secured permission from the cemetery warden under some pretext of verifying structural weaknesses, and Lestrade, though skeptical, had agreed to a discreet observation. Holmes pressed gently on a panel near the crypt's side. To my astonishment, the stone gave way with a slight grind. A hidden entrance, nearly invisible, revealed a steep, narrow staircase descending into the gloom. "This," he whispered, "is no accident of masonry." Lantern in hand, we descended. The air was thick, almost oily, and smelled faintly of mildew and something more elusive. Iron and wrought. At the bottom lay a small chamber lined with stone shelves, once used to store funeral urns. Some were still there, others smashed. At the far wall stood a stone slab, scraped and blackened as if by fire. A single candle, long melted, had once burned atop it, and then I saw it. Near the wall, half hidden beneath an old shroud, lay another playing card, the Jack of Hearts this time, pierced cleanly through with a rusted nail. Holmes knelt beside it, eyes glittering. He's marked his next move. But hearts, not spades. He's changing the suit. The symbolism shifts. I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. "Holmes, this is ritual." Holmes didn't reply. He stood, pulled the nail free, and turned it in the lantern light. It was old, hand-forged Victorian perhaps, but glistening, with some recent tarnish. "This is our pivot, Watson. The killer is not just leaving a trail. He's constructing a theater, and we are the audience he intends to torment." Suddenly, from the corridor above, a sound soft, like stone sliding across stone. We extinguished the lantern. A shape passed across the opening of the stairwell, silent, cloaked. Holmes raised his hand to keep me still. We listened as the sound of footsteps receded into the upper chambers. Then, after a moment of tense silence, Holmes spoke low. "We are no longer alone in this game. He knows we're watching." Back in our rooms at Baker Street later that night, Holmes returned to the map. His finger traced a line from the chapel to the well, then to the gardener's shed. "A triangle, the symbol," he murmured. "The crescent is not merely a brand. It marks boundaries, a ritual perimeter." He turned to me, eyes sharp. "The third death will complete it. And if we do not uncover the truth before that happens, the next victim may be chosen not by chance, but by design." Chapter 10, Shadows. Beneath the stained glass, the morning following our descent into the crypt brought with it no clarity, only heavier skies and a silence that seemed to hang over Baker Street like the hush before a funeral. Holmes had slept little, pacing the floor with increasing urgency, his long fingers pressed together as he sifted and reshuffled fragments of thought in that formidable mind of his. "I fear we are missing the fulcrum of the matter, Watson," he said at last, pausing by the window where rain tapped listlessly on the panes. "The bodies, the cards, the crescent scars, all vital components, and yet none quite explain why now. What is it that stirred the killer after all these years?" He turned, eyes narrowing. "The answer may lie not in the pattern of murder, but in the disruption of silence. Someone, something provoked this spree." Just then, a knock came upon the door, and Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing a card on a silver tray. "It's the Reverend from St. Jude, sir. He says it's urgent." We looked at one another. Holmes nodded. "Show him in at once." A moment later, the door opened to reveal the familiar figure of Reverend Lionel Swithin, his coat and collar soaked from the rain, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, removing his gloves with shaking hands. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion, but something has occurred at the chapel." Holmes gestured him to the fire. "Take your time, Reverend. Begin at the beginning." Swithin sat stiffly, his gaze troubled. "This morning, while preparing for the noon service, I entered the nave and noticed that one of the stained glass panels, the easternmost, depicting the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, had been smashed." Holmes's brows lifted. "Vandalism?" "I thought so at first. But it was precise, Mr. Holmes. Only one figure was broken, the face of the saint. The rest untouched. And behind the broken glass, tucked into the wooden frame, I found this." From his coat, he produced a folded piece of parchment. Holmes took it delicately, unfolding it to reveal a page torn from a book of common prayer. Words crossed through with ink, leaving only a line beneath. In the shadow of his wings shalt thou make thy refuge, until these calamities be overpast. Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes handed the parchment back. May the first see the chapel. Immediately, Swithin nodded. I have arranged it. By noon we were once again at St. Jude's Chapel, its Gothic arches and narrow nave looming solemnly against the bleached sky. Rain had ceased, but a dampness clung to the stones like breath upon glass. The broken stained glass panel was exactly as Swithin described. The surrounding saints glowed intact in the filtered light, but St. Bartholomew's face was obliterated, shards of red and blue scattered across the tiled floor. Holmes stood motionless before it, lips tight. Do you see it, Watson? I peered closely. The figure is the only one holding a knife. Precisely, Holmes murmured. The symbol of his martyrdom flaying, removed deliberately, and the page tucked behind it. Not random. This is not merely religious commentary. It's part of a riddle. He turned to Swithin. Has anything else gone missing? The Reverend hesitated. Well, yes. A week ago, one of the old registers from the burial archive vanished. I thought little of it. Those ledgers go back centuries. We have very few visitors to that archive. Holmes nodded slowly. I must see your burial records. All of them. Particularly for the year 1878. Swithin's face changed. Why that year? I believe, Holmes replied, that our killer's origin lies there. Within the chapel's vestry, Holmes moved rapidly through the leather-bound ledgers, his long fingers flipping pages with almost manic precision. Finally he paused. There, he said. Watson and I leaned in. Name, Jonathan Tiernan. Date of interment, November 12, 1878. Occupation, sexton. Cause of death, fall from bell tower. Remarks, no kin present. Body interred near east wall, under church. Authority. Holmes tapped the entry. A gravedigger, possibly the original one connected to this site. Died tragically, and it seems unclaimed. Lestrade, who had joined us by this point, frowned. And what of it? Holmes turned sharply. Look around you, Lestrade. A modern killer with intimate knowledge of the chapel's architecture, its crypt, and a fondness for theatrical messaging. Someone who might be reclaiming the story of a forgotten man. I interjected, but why now? Why revive the memory of Tiernan after nearly 50 years? Holmes lifted the register. Because perhaps Tiernan didn't fall. Perhaps he was pushed. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes worked in feverish silence. He had spread several maps across the floor, blueprints of the chapel, cemetery, and old sketches of the grounds from 1870 to 1900. Watson, look at this. He pointed to a narrow corridor once connecting the old Gravedigger's hut to the bell tower, long since sealed by a later renovation. If Tiernan discovered something that threatened another, he could have been silenced. And now, our present killer seeks to avenge or repeat what was done to him. I nodded slowly. You believe this is a legacy crime? Precisely. A killer with a family tie or a fanatical belief. Each victim may represent a figure from Tiernan's time, a vicar, a groundskeeper, perhaps even a conspirator. He paused. There's more. The cards left behind spades, then hearts represent not merely suits, but roles. The betrayer, the lover. The next will be the jack of clubs, the symbol of conflict or strife, likely a constable or someone in law. A chill passed over me. You mean Lestrade? Holmes didn't answer directly. He must be warned. But before we could act, a telegram arrived, written hastily, without a sender's name. To Emma Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. You seek too loudly. The dead deserve their silence. Do not go to the tower at midnight. J. Holmes set it down carefully. Well, he said grimly, now we must go to the tower at midnight.